Monday, August 17th. And we are very excited because this date, this week, is the 100th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment. So we are celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage this week here at the library and throughout the nation. We are very excited. We have Shelley Blood. She is a docent from the Tampa Bay History Center with us, who is going to be speaking about Tampa women's suffrage, about the local suffrage and statewide suffrage movement. So I'm very excited to learn about that tonight. There are a few things I want to let you know. First, my name is Amanda. I'm with Tampa Hillsborough County Public Library. We will be having a full week of suffrage programming. So if you have had a chance to look at our online events calendar, or you can go onto our website. We have a landing page, hcplc.org/suffrage. I'll be sharing that at the end. And you can find more cool programs, online events, documentaries, book lists, reading. It's going to be great. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Shelley and we will learn about Tampa women's suffrage.
Thank you, Amanda. So what I have to tell you about tonight is how it was different here than it was in some places. In Tampa, the women's suffrage movement started early and late. We were
Shelley,
both early and late.
Want to turn off your... Oh, I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to, before we get started, did you want to turn off your camera or leave on?
Can you turn it off for me, or do I do that here?
You know what? There we go. There we go. Okay, there we go.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, we're ready? So in Tampa, the suffrage movement was both early and late, and you'll see that as I go through the presentation. Well, it is not responding. There we go, finally. Okay, sorry about that. There was a slight delay. So the very first record that we have of involvement in the suffrage movement was the, I'm sorry, I'm getting certain problems here. It's not responding. Okay, here we go again. Hopefully this is going to work this time. A few of these little technical glitches. So the first record that we have is of a petition that was sent to Elizabeth Cady Stanton from a gal named Kate Binkley here in Tampa. And this is what she had said. Essentially, she's saying that we women have taxation without representation. And we also found a record that indicated that another one of the signers to this petition, there were 14 people that signed the petition out of the 720 people that were here in Tampa, which, if you take that into consideration, would be the equivalent of 7,000 people signing a petition today. But back then, the 14 people that signed, one of them was Julia Severs, who documents show that she was in regular correspondence with Susan B. Anthony, and that in one of those letters in 1885, she had indicated that she had been part of the women's suffrage movement since 1855 for 30 years. So there was some early activity here. But what really made a difference in those early days was when Ella and Fielding Chamberlain moved to Tampa in 1883. And she was very passionate about the fact that women should have the right to vote. And she talked to everybody about it. She would go out on like kind of little mini speaking tours and speaking to clubs and so forth, and trying to get folks interested locally. And in 1892, the Chamberlains went back to Iowa just for a visit and attended the Women's Interstate Convention there. And she got so inspired that when she came back, she asked the editor of the Tampa Journal if she could write an article on a regular basis for that journal. And he said yes, but when she brought her first article in, he said, "Oh, I had in mind that you would do some things about, you know, housekeeping and child rearing." And her response to that was this: "The world is not suffering for another cake recipe." So he let her go ahead with her articles. And she also, some of those articles were picked up by the Tampa Tribune. And one of them that they picked up in 1893, this was her closing statement in that article, was that those who are opposed to women agitating for the vote should ask themselves if manhood has greater gifts. In other words, aren't we just as good, and shouldn't we therefore get the vote ourselves? So one of the things that happened was right around the same time, she and Fielding went to a social gathering, and she was talking about her feelings about women getting the vote. And one of the other people there at the party said, well, why don't you just start a society for this and start moving toward it? And so that evening at the party, she started recruiting people and got 12 women and 8 men to sign up that very night. And they ended up getting a bunch of literature to pass out. And so many people took the literature from them that they had to get a second printing. Now, what happened then was she decided that it was about time that they moved their movement to statewide, and we should start the Florida Women's Suffrage Association. And so in 1893, she did that, and she got people together, and they agreed to come to a meeting in Tampa in 1895. In the meantime, she was going around town and talking to various people, and we do know that she went a couple of times and talked to the Carpenters Union, but kind of surprisingly, she never did go to the Cigar Makers Union, which was a much bigger union. But possibly, though, it didn't occur to her that they would be interested. I don't know why. We really don't have an explanation since she didn't explain to us. But when she did when she arranged that 1895 convention here in Tampa, they actually had 100 members show up for that. And then the high point for the Chamberlains was in 1895. They went up to Atlanta for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and I see I have a typo there, in Atlanta, which was the first time that that meeting had been held in the South. And they got to be seated at the table with Susan B. Anthony. She introduced them. But Fielding was really the biggest hit at that meeting because he was the first male speaker that year. And he had quite a good sense of humor, so that went over quite well. So that was really the highlight. But 2 years later, the Chamberlains moved back to Iowa, and the whole movement fell apart here. But what was going on while that movement had fallen apart, what was going on here and throughout the country was the women's club movement. And what was generating this movement was that there were very different economics going on at the time, where there were women who were now self-supporting. Many of them were single, and they were college educated, and they were getting very involved in the community and showing off their management skills. And once they got interested in the suffrage movement, it really gave that movement a lot of traction and strength. And this was true both in the white community and the Black community of women. And in fact, within the white club movement, they generated a general federation of women's clubs to kind of act as an umbrella throughout the country. And in the Black community, the same thing happened. Just a little bit later, the Women's Federation for the white groups was created in 1890, and it was 1896 before the Federation of Colored Women's Groups was created. And then it wasn't until 1908 that Florida created a Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. And Mary Cloud Bethune, who I imagine some of you are familiar with, became the president of that Florida association and served in that capacity for until 1920. And what you'll see in this picture on the right is that Jacksonville developed their own suffrage movement within the Black women's clubs. And this is the delegation that attended the state meeting in Jacksonville in 1915. Now, if there was a movement here in Tampa, I could not find any documentation on it. And because, of course, I couldn't get into the libraries, I wasn't able to get into the archives of the Black newspapers that might have given me some information about that. So possibly later in the year, I will be able to add to this presentation. Speaking of clubs and club women, this was one of the most active. In fact, she was referred to as the super club woman. Her name was Julia Harrison Norris, and she was a member of every club and every organization that allowed women within the city of Tampa or the county of Hillsborough. She obviously traveled to New York and Washington at various times during those early years of the 1900s because she was elected chair of the legislative committee of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So that gives you an idea of how active she was. Another person that was very active in the community and in the club movement was the creator of the Tampa Civic Association, Kate Jackson. Now, Kate didn't create this on her own. Of course, there were other women involved with her, including Julia Norris. They were involved in the Civic Association as well as the Tampa Women's Club that had started a few years earlier. The Civic Association was really for improvements, kind of infrastructure improvements, like water and sewer and playgrounds and libraries. And the Women's Club was more involved initially in cultural issues, but did get involved in politics as time went on. In Jacksonville, the movement was coming along right about the same time, about in 1912, a year later. And there were 30 women there that got together and created what they called the Jacksonville Equal Franchise League. And once word got around about that through the clubs, Orlando and Lake Helen started their own franchise leagues. And in 1913, the Florida Equal Suffrage Association was created, and that included people from Tampa, Miami, Orlando, and Jacksonville. In 1913, also, the league in Jacksonville petitioned the state legislature, but as I'm sure that you probably realize, that went nowhere. It was simply rejected. Another woman who was very involved in this whole movement in Tampa was Elizabeth Askew. Elizabeth had already made the newspapers by being appointed the first female bank clerk in Tampa. And in 1914, she made a speech at a civic club meeting. And, you know, you can look at this quote and see that she was kind of harsh. She sounded pretty angry. She called people that opposed women's voter right to vote as ignorant and prejudiced and dishonest and vicious, which probably didn't win over a lot of people, but that was going to be her approach. Some others, you know, we've been working on this for 55, 60 years by then, and maybe she was impatient. On December 13th, there was an article in the Tampa Morning Tribune that included a response from Askew. This took up almost a whole page, and they had asked 9 of the leading women in Tampa to give their opinions about women's suffrage. 5 of those responses were supportive and 4 of them were not. one of the ones that was not said that she hardly had time to keep up with all of her responsibilities at home, and she certainly didn't have time to vote. But on the other hand, one of them said that she just felt that the last 25 years of her life was going to be wasted if she couldn't get the vote, when she felt that she could do so much more once the kids were out of the house. That same year, 1915, was the National Convention in Washington, and our Askew was able to go and represent Florida at that meeting. She also was 2 years later invited to take part in the presidential inauguration parade, which was representing Florida, which was the first year that women had been allowed to march in that parade. This person is actually not from Tampa, Wilbur Grace Trout, and not from Florida. She was a woman from Chicago. She was very, very successful in Chicago in getting the women's vote much earlier than the country would get it as a whole. She managed to talk the Chicago City Council into giving women the vote in local and the presidential elections, so that the only thing that they weren't able to vote on were the statewide elections, and they felt they would have a chance to sway the state legislature over. So we're not sure. We think that maybe when Elizabeth Askew had gone to Chicago to kind of find out what was going on up there that she could bring back home, she may have recruited Grace to come down, because Grace came down to Jacksonville and spent a year helping out with recruitment there in 1915. The following year, Alice Snow, who was a Tampa resident, decided that she wanted to run for the school board, because in spite of the fact that women didn't have the vote, they were not prohibited from running for office. I don't know how many people this occurred to prior to Alice deciding to run, but she did. And out of the 4,000 votes that were cast for the school board, she only lost by 15, which means that her friends were doing a pretty good job of lobbying those men who were able to vote. Just outside, just south of Tampa, outside the city limits, down in Ruskin, down in South Hillsborough County, we had a couple of very active suffragettes. Now, the one on the left, Kate Richardson O'Hara, was, in addition to being a suffragette, or possibly more importantly than being a suffragette, she was a socialist. And she went around speaking on socialism, and the women's right to vote just kind of went along with that whole approach. But unfortunately, in that year of 1917, that she was so vocal, she was found guilty of sedition and sent to jail for 5 years. On the right side, the right-hand picture, you see what was called street speaking, which I think originated in London, in Hyde Park. And this is where someone just goes out and gets themselves into a higher position than street level and starts talking and draws a crowd. One of the people that I reviewed this with noticed that this was mostly men in the audience for her, and said, gee, look at that. But gee whiz, she was going to have to appeal to men, because women didn't have the vote, so women weren't going to be able to change that factor. But that woman was Harriet Orcutt, and she was also a professor at the Ruskin College during this time that she was working as a suffragette as well. Mary Nolan was a suffragist from Jacksonville. And you might have noticed that sometimes I use the term suffragist and sometimes suffragette. And that's because both of those became interchangeable. Initially, suffragette was kind of poking fun at women who wanted to vote. But the women in the movement decided that they were going to turn it around and make it their own, so that it no longer became like a criticism or a nickname for them. Mary Nolan was one of the suffragists out of Jacksonville, and in 1917, she was one of a group of women that picketed in front of the White House. You can see the group right here. What happened was that at some point, and these women got a great deal of criticism initially. They thought that the public thought that this was disrespectful to the president. And so they did get arrested. Nolan got arrested 5 different times, but there was something that happened that kind of turned the tables. They were taken to jail, and the warden said, yeah, rough them up a little bit, teach them a lesson. And the guards went a little bit crazy and beat them very badly. One of them ended up with a concussion. A number of them had to be treated for injuries, had to be taken to the hospital. And what this did was it reversed public opinion, and it gave them a great deal of sympathy. And Mary Nolan wrote an article for the Suffragist Journal talking about that night that they were beaten so badly and called it the Night of Terror. And that really kind of changed the whole tone of the public toward the suffragists. Now, Tampa had not really recovered from the loss of Ella Chamberlain until 1917, when the Florida League decided that they would meet here in Tampa, and they decided that the other members of the league would help Tampa get reorganized again. And so they did, and the first time that the Tampa Equal Suffrage League was formally and officially named was right after that 1917 state meeting. And our friend Kate Jackson from the Tampa Civic Association actually hosted the very first meeting of the Tampa Equal Suffrage League. Now, some other things were going on in the state as well. Up in Tallahassee, Mary Mann Jennings was very busy lobbying the legislature. Her father, Austin Mann, had been both a state representative and a state senator. And when he held those positions, Mary, as his daughter, was also his aide. So she had gotten to know everybody in the state legislature. And then she married William Jennings, and he got elected as governor, which gave her even more influence. And so she was quite active. She also was involved with many of the women's clubs, and so was able to work with them as well as the legislators. And later on, after we did get the vote, she was one of the co-founders in Florida of the League of Women Voters, the Florida League. She was also assisted by a relative, a cousin. This is Mary Bryan, and Mary was married to William Jennings Bryan, who maybe you are familiar with his name from history. He ran for president at one time, and he had been in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet and had a falling out with Wilson and quit, and the family came down to Miami. And so Mary Bryan joined Mary Jennings in lobbying in Tallahassee. And she was very effective, however, maybe more effective with the press than she was with the legislature. There was certainly opposition, and opposition on many fronts. And this was one of the earliest things that came out in opposition, is this idea that if women got the vote, they would start neglecting their family responsibilities. And so here's somebody saying, if we let them vote and legislate, where will our dinners be? Which maybe might have been a little late. The opposition was pretty strong in a lot of quarters. It seemed that even probably 40 to 50% of the women in the country weren't sure whether or not they wanted the vote. And there was a whole organization called the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, and they got themselves started in 1911 and functioned until 1920 when we actually did get the vote. One of the strongest arguments about this was that so many of the women who were involved in the suffrage movement had also been involved in the temperance movement. And so the concern was that if women got the vote, that prohibition would take effect. Of course, the irony of that is that men passed prohibition a year before women got the vote. Throughout Florida, though, by 1918, 16 towns and 20 counties in Florida had given the vote to their female residents in local elections. And in our area, some of those towns that did give women the vote prior to 1918 were Clearwater, Dunedin, St. Petersburg, Tarpon Springs, Paso Grill, and Ruskin. But finally, in 1919, on June 4th, the Congress passed the 19th Amendment. We did that without the vote of our two senators at the time, Duncan Fletcher and Park Tremmell. But the Florida governor, Sidney Katz, saw this as a terrific opportunity. The legislature, the Florida legislature, was still in session and had enough time to be the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And there actually were enough votes to carry the ratification. The problem we ran into is they didn't have the 2/3 majority that they would need in order to change the rules to allow that late a topic to be brought up for vote. So it didn't happen. And in fact, we, Florida, who had the opportunity to be the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment, were in fact the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and that did not happen until 1969. And that is Florida's story. Thank you.
Okay, Shelley. I'm going to go ahead. Let's go ahead and bring our cameras back on. I'm going to bring up a couple slides. So this is the time while we are bringing those up. If anybody has any questions in your control panel, there is a question section. So go ahead and type those in, and we are going to ask those to Shelley. So let me go ahead. We're going to change slides here just briefly. It'll take just a second. Okay, so before we do, while you are typing your questions, or if anybody has questions to type, I do want to do a quick book shout out. So if anybody is interested in learning more about local women in Florida, we do have the book by Doris Weatherford, They Dared to Dream, Florida Women Who Shaped History, and you may find some of the women in today's presentation in that book. I do want to also let you know we have had this in the collection, but we just got digital copies. So you can check this out on Overdrive. You can check it out electronically. That's hcplc.org/ebooks to find our digital books and our electronic book collection. I do want to point out Doris Weatherford will be with us on Thursday evening doing an author talk about her newest book called Victory for the Vote. So if you are interested in that, definitely check out our events calendar to register for that program. I am going to bring up this closing slide. It will give you information about contacting us. There is our events calendar. On our calendar, we also have some links to some really cool national online displays and exhibits. For example, the Library of Congress has one for women's suffrage. So if you want to find those, you can check out not only our upcoming live online programs, but some of our upcoming displays and exhibits that we have linked to. we have contact for the library. If you want to call us, learn more about our programs, about using your library card, getting your library card going, you can always give us a call or contact us electronically. And we have shared Shelley Blood is a docent at the Tampa Bay History Center. So if you want to learn more about the Tampa Bay History Center, definitely check out their website at www.tampabayhistorycenter.org. So I'm going to go ahead and check our questions. Okay, so here is one of our first questions, Shelley, and that is, did the white and black women's group share ideas and work with each other, or were they kind of separate group? Were they separate?
For the most part, they were separate. And that certainly was very, very true in the South and would have been true here. In some cities, it was more, what's the best word, fraternal. The Chicago, New York, not so much DC, but in the bigger cities, there was some working together. Ida Wells was from Chicago, and she was a very, very active, one of the best known. She and Sojourner Truth were two of the biggest suffragists in their movement, and they were very active and worked with white groups as well, and the folks that they were working with in their groups. But in the South, that did not happen at all. It was kind of accepted that we will work on it, and we know we're working on it, but we're not going to work on it together. There was some kind of feeling that it might actually harm the cause if this became public.
Right. And in a lot of books that have been published recently, they really do, for example, the Women's Hour by Elaine Weiss that came out recently, they really do take an honest look about race relations within the suffrage movement. So those are some interesting, if you reading more about that. Okay, so somebody did, I think we can tie these two questions together. So what year were women in Hillsborough County allowed to vote? And the first question is, did you say 1969? And I think there is some confusion because Florida did go back and ratify the amendment later kind of as a goodwill gesture, but people did not, women, I should say, did not have to wait till 1969 to vote. So in Hillsborough County,
in Hillsborough County, in fact, the first woman to register to vote was not a suffragist. I'll tell that little story. It's cute. The first woman to ever register to vote in Hillsborough County heard about that she could from her husband, who was the county attorney, called the county solicitor at the time, the county attorney, and his office was next to the supervisor of elections, who got the telegram saying that the state of Tennessee had done the necessary last ratification to make this legal, because it took 36 states to ratify before we got the vote. And Tennessee had just ratified it by one vote. And so the supervisor of elections got the telegram. He told the county attorney called his wife, and she ran down to the courthouse to register. But so the first time that we voted was the fall of 1920. We were able to vote because Tennessee had done the necessary ratification. Everything after that was just for appearance and as a man, for goodwill, because we really didn't need to. But kind of like the ERA, you want it to happen. You want your state to come on board, and we were really, really, really late. We were the very last.
Unfortunately, it's a record, but not the record we had wanted, perhaps.
Right.
I do want to read just a comment. It said, "Great job, very informative. Thank you." So we do echo those sentiments as well, Shelley. It was very. We've learned a lot. We do have a few more questions we're going to try to squeeze in. One question is, were women in Tampa jailed? And I'm not sure if they meant, were they jailed ever here in Tampa, or were women from Tampa ever part of demonstrations, maybe somewhere else, that they were sent to jail?
Not that I saw in any record. No women from Tampa were, certainly no women from Tampa were in that group that picketed. And for the most part, those were the women that were jailed. I don't remember hearing of other people that were jailed. Now, that said, that was a very horrendous thing they went through. I mean, they were force fed. They were, went on hunger strikes, were force fed. It was, it was bad. But and no, there was never any picketing here in Tampa. There was never any reason to jail a woman in Tampa for suffrage. If women were jailed, it was generally for prostitution.
Something else. So I guess our last question is, because we're just about, it's gone so fast, is do you have any recommendations? Is there anything that surprised you that people would want to read more about, or any book recommendations to check out to read more about the suffrage movement in Tampa and Florida, or in general?
Well, I know that Doris has, in fact, I have her book. Doris has a new book out called Victory for the Vote. And so one of the important things it does, there are dozens and dozens of books on women's suffrage out. And what I think is new for some of us looking into this are the number of new books on Black women's involvement. Also, there is a very interesting book, and again, just a little bit different from the standard history, is a book called Why They Marched. And I think the author's name is Jane Ware. And this is women who were not famous. This is women that you didn't hear of. These are women that were what you might call behind the scenes, but very important, and how they were involved with the movement and what they contributed. But we don't hear their names. There are about half a dozen women whose names we hear regularly.
Right. We have the figureheads who were very important and did a lot of work. But of course, the movement, it happened over roughly 70 years, just thousands of women across, doing just kind of like you showed tonight, the local movement, the local pushing forward locally. And then there was the national, the NAWSA and the National Women's Party as well, so which were affiliated, but it took everyone. It took everyone to achieve the victory for the vote. So thank you so much, Shelley, for joining us this evening. For anybody who's watching live, we do have a brief survey coming right after the program. If you do have time, we would really appreciate if you would fill that out. Once again, thank you so much, Shelley. I learned a lot tonight. I have some books I'll be adding to my book, and we hope to see everyone else at the next program. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.